In October 2015, the final trailer for Star Wars The Force Awakens was released, and amongst the hype-inducing content, one moment that enraptured fans was a brief glimpse at a group of mysterious masked strangers clad all in black who were stood alongside Kylo Ren. Fans would come to learn the name of this group as the Knights of Ren. Speculation was rife about their purpose and background. Could they be a new spin-off of the Sith, or a cult centered around Kylo himself? The possibilities for new villains had many excited. The look of the 6 members of the group were actually taken from rejected designs of Kylo Ren, which helped give the group a synergized appearance, and rather than using lightsabers, it was apparent each member had their own unique weapon. Unfortunately, the group only appeared in a quick Force vision. They had even less screen time than Luke Skywalker, leaving many disappointed, but hopeful the group would be fleshed out in the next 2 films in the trilogy. This wasn't to be the case. The group was completely absent from The Last Jedi, a casualty of the poor planning by executives at Lucasfilm. It was apparent that Rian Johnson had no plans to use the characters, and it's possible he wasn't even aware of their existence until he had written the majority of his story. When J.J. Abrams was brought back to write Episode 9, the group was finally going to be involved in something more than a 5-second clip. Promotional photos were released from production showing the characters in more detail, but once again their involvement in the film was minimal at best. Only serving as background figures for the majority of their time on screen, they ended up fighting Ben Solo, but as it turns out, cool looking weapons are no match for a lightsaber, and they died in relatively quick fashion. And so what could have been a promising set of side villains turned into action figure fodder. They did get an expanded story in comics that followed, so let's have a look at who the Knights of Ren actually were. The group could be best described as marauders, Force sensitive but not aligned with the Jedi or the Sith, only the dark side. Up until Kylo Ren, the group didn't serve a leader per se, rather they followed the lightsaber known as the Ren. The wielder of this blade was bestowed the title of Ren and was essentially the figurehead of the group. Their only goal was to take whatever they wanted. They had no higher calling or code that they held themselves to. They were unapologetic and didn't care for the consequences of their actions. Not much is known of their history or exploits outside of a legendary and fearsome reputation. They had mostly kept themselves to the unknown regions, hence why there isn't much in the way of information on the group until the time of the Empire, when they had become more involved in galactic events. The group allied with Crimson Dawn in the hopes of overthrowing the Sith. They infiltrated Vader's castle on Mustafar, seeking to steal a key that Kira, the leader of Crimson Dawn, believed would unlock an ancient Sith weapon. They were successful in retrieving the key and the weapon, known as the Fermetta Cage, but their efforts were in vain as Darth Sidious was still able to defeat Crimson Dawn, and thus the Knights pledged themselves to Sidious. Even after his supposed death during the Battle of Endor, they knew he was still alive on Exegol. Their activities during this time included hunting Jedi relics, and the group's first encounter with Ben Solo came during their raid on an ancient outpost based on Elthrona. Luke Skywalker had already claimed the outpost for his new Jedi Order, and alongside his apprentice, they battled the Knights. Skywalker was able to defeat the group without killing them, and so they retreated, but they had left a lasting impression on young Ben Solo, and it could be argued that this was the first step on his path to the dark side. Following Ben Solo's betrayal and massacre at Luke's Jedi Temple, he turned to Snoke for guidance, and told him that he wanted to join the Knights of Ren. Solo was able to locate the Knights on Varnak. The price of admission to the Knights was to kill. Solo had been travelling with the Knights, but Ren was unimpressed. Eventually, Ren attacked Solo, but was defeated and killed by the former Padawan. The rest of the Knights bowed and recognised the newly christened Kylo Ren as their leader. And so for the years afterwards, the Knights would follow their new leader in his quest to conquer the galaxy in the name of the First Order, alongside his aim of killing Luke Skywalker. They would ravage worlds and kill anyone who got in their way until the events of the sequel trilogy began to play out. So who were the last members of the Knights of Ren? We know the group was formerly led by the individual named Ren, a human who wielded the red saber that gave him his power. He had killed the previous owner, who was also called Ren, and he had led the group from the time of the Empire until his death at the hands of Ben Solo. The other members of the group were Cardo, who took care of the group's armour and weapons. He wielded an arm cannon, and he was more than capable in a fight but lacked training in the Force. He preferred brute force over precision, and the cannon was more than powerful enough to cause massive amounts of destruction. Vikral was more adept with his force powers but lacked control. He used a vibro scythe in battle, and he took enjoyment out of killing, believing himself to use the souls of his enemies to augment his own powers. Ushar was the most sadistic of the knights, taking enjoyment out of torturing prisoners and killing his enemies slowly. He used a war club in combat that could release concussive blasts that did extra damage. Trugden liked to collect trophies from his fallen foes, and an example of this is his helmet, which was partially formed from a death trooper he defeated in battle. He wielded a large vibro cleaver that, whilst clumsy and heavy, had devastating cutting power. Kuruk was able to use telekinesis, hinting that he was one of the more powerful knights when it came to the Force. In addition to being the group's pilot, he also served as their sniper, preferring to do battle from a distance rather than up close. The final member was Aplek, who was the only member of the group who didn't prefer violence as a first option, instead resorting to deception and clever tactics to defeat his opponents. He used a modified Mandalorian executioner's axe made from Beskar. He also carried around smoke canisters that would allow him to distort visibility on the battlefield and provide cover. Each member was unique in fighting style and abilities, but in the end, none were a match for Ben Solo or poor writing choices. Whilst flushing out their characters in comics and novels is entertaining to read, the fact that they had barely 5 minutes of screen time across 3 films is another indication of the massively missed potential that the sequel stories had. The group should have been front and centre as the villains. No First Order playing the part of the Empire, but rather a personal story between Luke, Rey and Kylo Ren that spanned across a trilogy. This, unfortunately, wasn't to be, and we are left forever wondering what could have been.